Now in this video, we are going to look at the possible consequences of these current account deficits, which, remember, we have just learned that they tell us that the country is importing too much and it is therefore spending too many dollars. And these current account deficits, therefore we learned, economists say that they reflect the country is living beyond its means. Now the consequences of this overspending, of getting into these current account deficits, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of things that can go wrong. There are a lot of different problems that a country can get into if it keeps on overspending and if it keeps on getting into these current account deficits. And we will learn all of these different complications, all of these different problems that the country may eventually get into because of these current account deficits. But the first important thing that you need to understand is that the most direct impact of a current account deficit and the way it can start creating problems for the country is that as soon as a country gets into a deficit of the current account, then the first thing that happens is that the country's exchange rate, that will come under pressure to depreciate. That is the start of all the problems that these current account deficits may create. It is not a problem in itself, as we will learn soon, but it can lead to all sort of other issues. Now, let me first of all explain why current account deficit puts a pressure on exchange rate to depreciate. Now, to understand that is very easy. You simply need to recall that all of these inflows of dollars, they create the demand for the local currency, rupee, since we are again going to assume we are talking about Pakistan's balance of payment. Whereas all of these outflows of dollars, remember, they create supply of the local currency, the rupee. And since a current account deficit, it reflects that the country's outflows of dollars are more than inflows, that is where these current account deficits, these large outflows of dollars, they create a very large supply of rupee in the FX market. Supply of rupee ends up being more than its demand. That is, there is an excess supply of rupee because of these large outflows, because of these current account deficits, this overall net outflow of dollars. It creates this excess supply of rupee in the FX market. And that is what puts pressure on the country's exchange rate, because exchange rate, remember, it's just the price of one currency in terms of another. So let me give you an example over here to make things more concrete. Let's assume Pakistan starts the year with an exchange rate of $0.8 per rupee. Now this exchange rate, you see, it's simply the price of this rupee in terms of another currency. So when your current account deficit creates excess supply of rupee, then the price of rupee, this exchange rate, that will be under pressure to fall in value, to depreciate to, let's say, just $0.6 per rupee. That is, these current account deficits, when your country is overspending and buying too many things from other countries relative to what it sells to them, that is basically putting pressure on your rupee to lose value. It is putting pressure on rupee to become cheaper, less valuable. Now, this is not always a bad thing. This pressure on exchange rate to depreciate in the face of these current account deficits, it's not always a bad thing. In fact, you can think of this as sort of a self-correcting mechanism that tries to kick in when a country gets into a deficit of the current account. This pressure on exchange rate to depreciate, I'm saying this can be a self-correction for these current account deficits, meaning that if your country allows your exchange rate to depreciate, you may correct these current account deficits. You may get rid of these trade deficits. And the simple reason why that may happen is because, you see, when a country's exchange rate depreciates, then its exports will become cheaper and its imports will become more expensive. Now, let me explain quickly why is that the case. Why depreciated exchange rate means, first of all, cheaper exports. You see, just assume there is a Pakistani product whose price is 1 rupee. Now, at the original exchange rate, foreigners, to get this Pakistani product, they would have required just $0.8. But once Pakistan's exchange rate depreciates, then to get this Pakistani product whose price, let's assume, stays at 1 rupee, now foreigners would need just $0.6 instead of $0.8. So that is where we say that exports will become cheaper. And similarly, imports, they become expensive. Again, let me give you the logic for that. You see, think of a Pakistani guy who wants to buy things from other countries and therefore he needs to pay for those things in dollars. Remember, import is an international transaction. Now, at the original exchange rate, with every 1 rupee, Pakistanis were able to get $0.8 and go buy things from other countries. But once your exchange rate depreciates and your rupee becomes less valuable, then with every 1 rupee, you will just be able to get 0.6 instead of $0.8. So that is what makes your imports more expensive when your exchange rate depreciates. Every rupee ends up getting fewer dollars than before for these Pakistani potential importers. Now, coming back to our main story, this current account deficit, it puts pressure on exchange rate to depreciate. Exports become cheaper, imports become expensive. And this is where we say that, look, this may help you get rid of your trade deficits. Because if your exports are cheaper, then maybe foreigners, they will start buying much more. And if they do, you will start earning more export dollar inflows or more export earnings. That may help you resolve your trade and ultimately current account deficits. And on the other hand, when your exchange rate depreciation makes your imports more expensive, then that may discourage Pakistani people from buying so many things from other countries. And if Pakistanis actually start buying much fewer imports than before, then this import spending will also decrease. Again, first helping you resolve your trade deficit and ultimately your current account deficits. So that is the sense in which we say exchange rate depreciation. It can self-correct these current account deficits. But you see, the thing is that many countries, they avoid this self-correction and they don't want this exchange rate to depreciate. And there are a lot of reasons for that. Why countries may not want their exchange rates to depreciate even when they know that it will help them improve their current account deficits. And out of those many reasons, let me just give you a couple of more relevant reasons in the context of what we are trying to get to. Now, you see, the first reason why countries may not want their exchange rate to depreciate is simply that when your imports become more expensive, then you see your country will, it will have to suffer from imported inflation. And you have to remember that, you do import a lot of useless things such as cosmetics and chocolates and, luxury products such as, laptops and so on and so forth. Not useless, but useless in the sense that as compared to these consumer goods that you buy from other countries, many countries, they also rely on importing essential inputs and raw materials such as petroleum and coal from other countries. And when your imports become expensive, all of these imported raw materials and inputs, they also become more expensive. And that means that there is going to be an overall increase in the general cost of production of your country. Your imported petrol, your imported coal is becoming expensive. It becomes more expensive to run your industry. And therefore, there will be quite a widespread cost push inflation whenever your exchange rates depreciate. So that is one of the reasons why countries may not want to go for this self-correction. And then to understand the second reason and the more important reason in the context of what we are trying to understand here, you see, you need to first of all know the difference between this persistent versus one-off current account deficits. A persistent current account deficit, remember, means when a country gets into a deficit in, let's say, year 1 and 2 and 3 as well as 4, 5 and 6. That is sort of continuous year after year of current account deficits. As opposed to these persistent current account deficits, sometimes countries will go into a one-off deficit, meaning out of 6 years, you have just one bad year where your current account goes into a deficit. Now, the reason why this difference is important is because, you see, when we talk of countries getting into problems of current account deficits, we are not talking about these countries with one-off current account deficits. For them, this self-correction is fine. It's not a bad option. Yes, you will suffer some imported inflation, but it's a one-off current account deficit. You just let your exchange rate depreciate a little bit once and that's it. End of story. Your current account is resolved. But when we are talking about persistent current account deficits, and that is what countries like Pakistan face, They have structural causes of current account deficits that are something which are permanent. So every year you go into a current account deficit, and then this is not an option. You can't just let your exchange rate depreciate every year. You will, of course, have imported inflation, but more than that, your exchange rate will eventually collapse. It will go down to zero. Your rupee will become valueless, and of course, that would spell total economic disaster. That would mean that your country has internationally, it has gone sort of bankrupt. And that is where things get interesting. Or, these current account deficits start becoming potentially problematic when you have persistent current account deficits and you need to defend your exchange rates from depreciating, which is possible but not always easy. Because as countries try to defend their exchange rate faced with these persistent current account deficits, they start getting into all sort of other economic complications. And to understand what countries will have to do to defend their exchange rate and why that might in turn create other economic complications, we now need to bring in the financial account, the second main component of our balance of payments. Because you see, if your country has a persistent current account deficit every year of, let's say, $20 billion, then the only way it can then defend its exchange rate from depreciating is to somehow attract an opposing amount of a net inflow or a net surplus of $20 billion within its financial account, and therefore balance off the whole balance of payments. And most of the countries, they are able to do that. If they are trying to defend their exchange rate in spite of these persistent current account deficits, many countries, they are able to attract these financial account inflows and net surpluses, and therefore, defend their exchange rates. But the real issue is not whether there is an overall net inflow into the financial account. As I said, many countries are able to achieve that. They are able to defend their exchange rates. But what really matters is which part of the financial account is attracting those net inflows and therefore financing these current account deficits. That is what matters, because you see, the only safe way out for a country with persistent current account deficits when it tries to defend its exchange rate, the only safe option, or you can say the best case scenario, is if these current account deficits are financed by an opposing amount of net inflows of foreign investments. That is, if your country overspends and buys too many imports and gets into a current account deficit, but every year then if foreigners, they are willing to bring in their money and invest in your country, then even these persistent current account deficits, they are not going to be an issue. Because you see, these foreign investment inflows, they resolve your balance of payments problems and they don't have a lot of negative side effects. These foreign investments, when they come into your country, if anything, they bring in positive side effects. Foreigners, they are coming in, they will bring in new technology, new management techniques, they will create employment and so on and so forth. So it's sort of a win-win situation for a country. And this is a rare case in the sense that there are very few countries who get into such a lucky situation. And one example of such a country is the USA. Every year they overspend, they buy too many imports, they have one of the biggest current account deficits of any country in the world. But then every year foreigners, they are willing to come and invest in the US, bring their money into that country and therefore balance their balance of payments and finance or fund the overspending of the Americans. But it's a rare case because you see, USA is one of the strongest economies the world has perhaps ever seen. So it is very easy for them to attract foreign investments every year. People love to go and start businesses in the USA. People love to invest in New York Stock Exchange and so on and so forth. But your normal average country like Pakistan, your typical agricultural developing economy, obviously it's not that lucky. If anything, they are not able to attract, any significant amounts of foreign investment inflows. They try desperately, but they are unable to do that. And that is where eventually current account deficits start to bite. When they are not financed by foreign investment inflows. Because then to defend your exchange rates, you will be left with these three other options. And out of these three, first of all, the central bank of the country will jump in and it will start drawing down on its FX reserves to balance these current account deficits. Now, the way that works is that the central bank will, given this $20 billion of deficit, the central bank will take out $20 billion from its reserves and come and start selling them in the FX markets. And in return, the central bank will buy or demand rupees. So that will artificially inject dollars into the country system, and it will artificially create demand for the rupee. So it will balance your balance of payments. It will take the pressure off your exchange rate from depreciating as well. So this is a policy that can be used. But again, remember, we are talking about persistent current account deficits. So your central bank may be able to do this for a few months or a few quarters or a few years at best, but eventually, you see, we are talking about billions of dollars over here, so eventually your central bank will simply run out of these FX reserves. So this is the first thing that countries which are not being able to finance their persistent current account deficits through foreign investments, the first thing that they will try to do, they will start drawing down on their FX reserves, but as I have just explained, they will soon run out of this option. Then the next thing that they will try to do is that they will try to attract hot money inflows. Now remember, we have learned that what you need to do in order to attract hot money is that you need to increase the interest rate of your country. And the problem here is that, you see, if you increase the interest rates to attract hot money inflows and balance your balance of payments, you also need to remember that increasing interest rate, it is equivalent to implementing tight monetary policy in your country. That is, remember, tight monetary policy, you increase the interest rate, the amount of domestic investment in your country's economy, that goes down. And because of that, your country's aggregate demand will shift to the left, your GDP will fall, your employment will decrease, your incomes will decrease. That is, there is a conflict between these two macro policy targets or objectives. On the one hand, you want to correct your external front, the balance of payments, by increasing the interest rates, but then on the other hand, you will end up squeezing your domestic economy. So you may try to increase your interest rates maybe for a few months, but you can't keep your interest rates at very high levels for years to correct your persistent current account deficits. You will just sort of kill your domestic economy. You will squeeze it, you will throw it into a depression. So that is where we say persistent current account deficits, you will run out of this option as well. And eventually, you will end up having to borrow and take loans either from other countries or, in most of the cases, from international donor organizations such as IMF and World Bank and so on and so forth. Now that would, of course, first of all, make your country indebted, which is bad for obvious reasons. Secondly, that will create the issue that, in the future years, you will have to pay interest payments on these loans, which will be creating interest outflows from your current accounts for future years, worsening your current account deficits of the future. But that is a very minor thing as far as the problems of these international loans are concerned. Because you see, if you think that you will go to IMF with $20 billion of deficit and they will hand over $20 billion and just tell you to go and enjoy yourselves, well, good luck. Because that is not how things work. IMF, before they give you any loan, they will tell you to go back and put your own house in order, and they will force you to make all of those hard economic decisions that you were trying to avoid. They will force you to take all of those decisions. And first of all, IMF will tell you that, look, you need to go back and depreciate your exchange rate. Yes, we know that that will create cost push inflation, but you need to let this self-correction work at least to some extent. They won't tell you to let this exchange rate crash, but they will tell you at least you have to let it depreciate somewhat. And then they will tell you that, look, you have to increase your interest rates and keep them at those high levels. We know your domestic economy will suffer, but you are coming to us as a sick country with this problem of persistent current account deficits. So you have to go through these painful years of decreasing the exchange rate, increasing the interest rates, and then they will give you some money, some amount of loan so that your economy can barely keep breathing. And you see, if you keep on getting into these persistent current account deficits, then things will get bad every year, because when you go to IMF every year for a loan, then gradually you won't have to ask for a loan, you will have to beg them for a loan. And you will have to then start doing whatever these international organizations and the countries who fund and control them tell you to do. So you see, it's just one thing saying that your country will become indebted, but once your country is dependent on these loans to keep your balance of payments and exchange rate stable, your country will start losing its economic as well as political independence. So that is where things can get really bad if you have persistent current account deficits and you don't do anything to solve the root problem, the root cause, the trade deficit. And instead, if you keep on trying to balance things off within this financial account, then if you are lucky and you have foreign investment inflows, then good for you. Otherwise, you will take this route from running out of FX reserves to running out of the options of attracting hot monies to ending up in the laps of these international donors. And that will be the end of story for many countries, in the sense that, it gets very difficult to get out of this sort of a debt trap that these current account deficits can throw a country into. So that is the story of the consequences of current account deficits. And by the end, it has gotten very serious in terms of, we have moved the discussion towards the worst outcome possible. But you do need to remember that the A-level exam will always ask you if these current account deficits, are they always bad for the country? So do remember that there is this self-correction, and therefore if it's a one-off current account deficit, not a huge issue. You just have to suffer from some imported inflation and that's it. You can let this self-correction take place if it's a one-off current account deficit. Whereas if it's a persistent current account deficit, then things are different. Then you need to defend your exchange rate, and the only safe option, remember, is if you are attracting foreign investment inflows. Otherwise, and that would be the core of your answer of when current account deficits are really bad, when they are not financed by foreign investment inflows. And you need to explain the sequence, sort of the road to trouble that the country will take. Starting off from drawing down of FX reserves, then attracting hot monies, and when it runs out of these two options, it will eventually have to take loans. And IMF will then start putting very harsh restrictions on the country, and it will force you to do a lot of other things, politically as well as economically, that you may as a country not wish to do.